Okay, so wanted to introduce myself. I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and here with Bob and Antonio. Would you like to introduce yourselves? Just a short introduction.
Sure. I'm Bob Wentworth, certified trainer, and I've been active in conversations in the NVC trainer network about bringing subjects like awareness of power and privilege by those terms or in other language into the NVC world, and been involved in some trainings in that, and happy to be in conversation about the subject today.
Great. Antonio?
I'm going to fix my lighting a little bit. Okay.
Looks pretty good.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Hi. So I'm Antonio, and I am here in New York City, where I tend to usually work with the New York Center for Nonviolent Communication here. Maybe just quick summary. I've been doing this work since 2012. I found out about it when I was an organic farmer in Maui, and it was enough to motivate me and inspire me to move back to New York to pick this up full time. And I started off volunteering for years, probably 4 or 5 years, and then was asked to begin teaching this. And I guess for maybe about little over a month now, I've been engaging in some dialogue with Bob, specifically in some exchanging. I think I've really enjoyed our communication about this and some of the sharing that we've had about this topic around privilege and power.
Okay, well, maybe I could set up, kind of give an overview of where I see before we kind of jump right into it. And so the overview that I have is that, Antonio, that you had posted some messages in the NVC group that caused a bit of a stir, and you'd shared some concerns about how privilege, the topic of privilege, power, racism, sexism, maybe sometimes under the rubric, this is a social justice, topic. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's or social justice warrior topic. Sometimes it's kind of brought under that, term. And you had some concerns about how that was being brought up in the NVC community. You'd posted that, and then there was it created a lot of dialogue, a bit of a stir. Bob teaches NVC and privilege workshops, and the two of you had dialogued about it, and there was a little bit of conflict, I would say, maybe a lot of conflict, various degrees of conflict in the discussion. And so I had offered to do some listening for you. So we did an hour of just listening to you, and we posted that video online. And so what we wanted to do here was have an empathy circle so we could really hear each other about this topic and explore it together. And we wanted to use what I call an empathy circle. There's different, versions of empathy circles. But in this process, one of us will speak. We'll select who we speak to. And the listener will reflect back their understanding of what the speaker has said to the satisfaction of the speaker. And when the speaker feels like they've been fully heard, you can say something like, "Oh, I feel fully heard." And then it's the turn of the listener to select who they're going to speak to, and that person reflects back. We just go around for the time allotted. And, if you're a listener and the speaker is saying a lot and you're kind of getting lost, what they're saying, you say, pause, let me reflect back what I've heard. And so that's the way to, kind of track that. And as a speaker, you want to pause, often just to give the listener a chance to reflect back. But I think all three of us here are experienced with these processes. So that's the basic framework. We're recording this and we'll post this online. There'll be a link to the previous discussion or listening I did for you, Antonio. And I do have my computer sometimes crashes with Zoom, so I'll be turning my video off periodically to minimize the chance of it crashing. So with that, I think we're ready to start. If anyone would like to begin, select who you'd like to speak to, and that person will reflect back, and we'll go for the time allotted. And I don't know how much time everyone has. I've got an hour and a half at least. If you're that okay.
That works for me.
Bob too. So okay.
Sure, I'm available.
Yeah.
So who would like to begin, and what would you like to share with, and to whom?
I'm open to anybody starting, by the way. So
okay, well, I'll start. I'll speak to you.
Cool.
Antonio. So I guess I want to say that I'm not really part of the NVC community per se, you know, that I come at this from wanting to build a culture of empathy. And so it overlaps with, you know, what's going on in the NVC community and in a lot of other communities. So I'm really coming at this from wanting to create an empathic environment for everyone. So if I could just get a reflection on that. Sure.
Yeah, sounds like so. Just to reflect some of that. Yeah, I'm hearing you're not necessarily what I would call like a trainer in the NVC community. However, it sounds like part of your big mission is to really create a culture of empathy, and NVC you see as a tool to contribute to that culture of empathy. Is that
that's it. Okay. And I have some real concerns about the topic of power privilege as well. So I would say I have a lot of resonance with, you know, your concerns about it. I've seen that this is a topic beyond NVC, that this is a topic in the universities as well. So this is coming up within the universities and in the society, you know, at large too. So this is a bigger discussion than is just happening here in the NVC community, and how this relates to empathy is really what I'm trying to understand and, you know, kind of work with as well, like I think both of you are.
Cool. I'll reflect some of that.
Yeah, cool. Just yep, please.
Yeah. I'm hearing there's some concerns for you around this topic also. There's some resonance that you had with some of my words. Yeah, and that it sounds like you're seeing this as a pretty big issue, a pretty broad discussion that's even happening in universities. Yeah, I guess you're trying to see the correlation between this conversation of power and privilege to how that connects to maybe empathy, something like that? Exactly, yeah. Okay. So with that, I feel fully heard. So it's your turn. Cool. I'm going to turn my video off. Cool. Actually, yeah, I'm wondering, and I'm curious, maybe what's going on for you, Bob. Maybe I can reflect if you'd like to share anything. If you'd be willing to stay within the framework, at least to begin with. Okay. If Bob just reflects back his understanding of what he just heard you say, and then you can say, I feel fully heard. Just okay, got it. And we'll do like a circle. Right. Okay. Does that work for you, Bob, also?
Let's go with it.
Okay, we'll give it a shot. Let's see. Just checking in here. Noticing just in my body, maybe, I guess some nervousness, some shakiness. I guess that for me has to do with, having a sense of care and consideration for everybody's words and for what's alive for everybody around this topic, even people who might be viewing this. I just feel that. I think it's like, I would call that holding, you know, the space for all of that. And as I'm holding that space, I can just feel some tenderness because I really do care about what's alive for people around this topic of power and privilege. So I guess that's the first thing for me. Maybe I'll just, if you could reflect some of that, Bob.
So there's some tenderness in you, wanting everyone to be held with care, getting that there's a lot of life for a lot of people around topics of power and privilege and NVC, and just wondering if you're just really wanting some consciousness as we approach this conversation, so this can be life-serving.
Yeah, thank you. I think it is about consciousness, and when I say the word care, just, you know, it does reflect what I said, so thank you. And I'm just connecting now to hearing myself say the word care. I think it's, when I say that word, I think it's about really caring. In the past few weeks, I've been able to talk with you, Bob, and it's just been very connecting for me to hear what's alive for you around this topic. I don't dismiss anything that's alive for you, and I don't dismiss anything that anybody has to share about this topic. I might not agree with it, however, I am moved when I hear the motivations behind wanting to talk about this subject. And so that, you know, to finally be able to put a face to some of the words of, you know, somebody who, you know, supporting these trainings, that has definitely been something that has been, it's been different, you know, like this whole time we've been doing a lot of messaging and commenting over Facebook, but a lot has changed because hearing, you know, the concerns for somebody around this topic, I want to be clear that, and I'll stop soon and just maybe I'll finish this. Hearing it gives me a visceral experience of the concerns that somebody has around this topic. Not to say that somebody's words in written form are, you know, don't give me some clarity, but I have really enjoyed connecting with what's alive in the moment. And that has been, so anyways, what I'm trying to say is like that by talking with you, Bob, it's giving me clarity as to your concerns around this topic, you know, and how it plays out in society. To the extent that I share those concerns, I just don't see them, you know, and again, maybe it's just a matter of like not agreeing of how they fit into the NVC paradigm, so to say. So, yeah, I'll stop there. If you could maybe reflect if you're willing to reflect.
Yeah, so one thing that I'm hearing is that you've noticed that it's been a different experience to move from the realm of written conversations with people that you may not have met to having, you know, video dialogue and some deep conversation and listening to one another. And that you've been moved and resonating with some of the deep concerns without necessarily agreeing at a strategy level. That it's been maybe there's just been something humanizing about being able to put a face and a voice to some of the things that are being said. And so on the one hand, you've been drawn more deeply into maybe sharing some of the concerns that are driving me. And you still have significant questions about how it all fits into the NVC paradigm. That's what I think I heard.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. That definitely captures my experience, and I'll maybe the last few words, and then I'll maybe be definitely curious of what's going on for you. I've been very aware of these topics probably ever since since my adolescence. And so I will say that the awareness of these topics is not necessarily something that I would call new for me. Again, I think I just see them maybe in a different context than what I would place NVC to be in the context of. So, yeah, I'm complete there. I'm fully heard. Thank you.
So, well, let me just reflect that to make sure I'm getting that part.
Yeah.
So, you've been aware of these topics, and I'm guessing by that you mean the way that some people are treated differently than others for reasons like the color of their skin. And you've been aware of that for a pretty long time, growing up in Harlem, I gather. And there's just a way that you see it as a different context from NVC. Is that it?
Yeah, that is it. And last thing is that I do see NVC, and now maybe this is like more of a strategy conversation. I'm not going to go into strategy, but I do see NVC as being able to really be not for everybody, but I do see NVC as being very instrumental in creating progress on the issues of race and privilege and power. So maybe that's more of a strategy conversation, that I do see NVC, being an instrument and a catalyst of change for these topics. Again, and maybe that's where the disagreement of strategy, of how, maybe the NVC workshops right now might not be meeting this, maybe the same needs that I would be trying to meet, meaning in the strategy way of how to have these discussions. So I think that for me is sort of like where the disagreement is on how the strategy is being executed to talk about these issues. So, and where I get that information from is from hearing, I've heard some of the recordings on the power and privilege conversations. I've talked to participants who've attended these workshops, and so I wanted to say that that's where I'm kind of getting some feedback, and that's where maybe I just disagree of how, on the strategy level, to have progress on these topics. So, yeah.
Yeah, so you've gotten information from listening to recordings and talking to participants, and that is a significant part of what leads you to assess that you would believe in a different strategy.
Right. I agree on the needs, that are trying to be met. I think I have similar needs and similar concerns. And again, maybe it's just not at the strategy level. Yeah, thank you. that does capture it.
Thank you. Okay. Edwin, I want to check on the format. So if I speak, are we automatically going in a circle in the sense that
no, you can speak to anyone you wish. Select whoever you want to speak. You can speak to me or Antonio. It's up to you. So you always have that choice.
Okay. I think I've got one piece that I would kind of like to speak to you, Edwin, and then a piece to Antonio, and I wonder if that would be okay.
Would it be okay if we kept it just one person, and you can speak through to that person, and just to stay within the form to begin with?
Well, I was partially trying to learn what the form is. It's not that I'm trying to break the form.
Yeah, so if you want to just speak to me, you can just say whatever, and eventually, yeah, until you feel heard.
Let me start there then. So I noticed two things. One is that there's part of me that is aware that this is being recorded and is likely to go out to a wide audience. And I just noticed that affects me. Mm-hmm. And it makes it, in some ways, more difficult to be simply present to who's here.
Okay, I'm hearing that you have awareness that this is being recorded, and because it's being recorded, it's perhaps inhibiting your speaking, or kind of affecting how you're speaking, and you're just having that sense of awareness that that's happening.
It's not so much that it's inhibiting as it's that it maybe divides my attention and injects some anxiety. And it's not that I'm normally anxious about public speaking or being seen by many people. I think it's more specifically because right now I notice that I'm carrying a lot of pain in my system. And when I look at my face on the screen, I see something that looks like grim, and it's, I'm worried that it won't be connecting to people, and that they'll say, who is this guy? I don't like him. And that's distracting me.
So what I'm hearing is you notice yourself that you're holding a lot of pain. There's it being recorded is also, there's some anxiety around that. And it's also your image of your body reflecting or showing that pain, that people will see you and say, oh, he's all kind of grumpy looking. I didn't say grumpy, but he's in pain, and they'll have like a negative judgment or not like you in some way because of it. And that has a sense of dividing your attention, because part of your attention is on, maybe what you want to say, and the other part is on how people might be seeing you.
Yeah. And there's a way that this all ties together, because I'm experimenting these days with not using the word privilege, and instead I'm likely to talk about things like having systemic advantage versus systemic disadvantage, or being someone whose experiences are normalized versus being someone who has an experience of marginalization. And my sense is that people who experience marginalization routinely have the experience of not being received in a warm and welcoming way that resonates for them, having their expressions be judged and perceived as wrong and undesirable in some way, not doing it right. And although I'm a person with systemic advantage in many ways, being a white, well-educated man, since I've begun advocating around these topics, I've increasingly experienced a sense of marginalization, that I'm often responded to ways that seem very unpleasant to me. And I think I'm building up a degree of, it sounds grandiose to call it trauma, but I think technically it's in that vein of experience in regard to how I've been received as I've moved into the world to express my concerns and hopes and whatnot around this topic.
Okay, so what I'm hearing there is that you're not using the word privilege, and you've moved to approaching it with different words, and it's this sense of marginalization, that people are marginalized, that they don't, when they try to express themselves, that they're not heard, that it's maybe judged or put down, and that you're finding that now that you started working around this topic, that you've been feeling a lot of marginalization, and there's a sense of pain that's come out of it, and that's kind of what I was getting so far. You're just noticing that hey, I'm talking about this marginalization, and that people are not receiving it, and they're dismissing me or marginalizing me around this as well. And it's painful. Mm-hmm. And it's even more than painful. It's creating a sense of almost of trauma, of feeling traumatized.
Yeah. And so when I, name that I seem to be carrying quite a bit of pain in my system today, which it's not always at this level. A significant amount of that pain relates to this topic and other things outside of my conversation with Antonio that have stimulated me in that regard. And yet, there's kind of this vicious circle that if I show up in this conversation as full of pain in a way that people don't get and are not feeling connected to, it can be one more experience of disconnect that deepens this growing trauma around not being heard, not being received with warmth, being in some sense, having a sense that I'm being vilified, which is, maybe grandiose compared to what I think is likely to happen in this conversation. But in the larger social dynamics around this issue, I experience trainers who talk out about this as being vilified.
So, see, what I'm hearing there is that is you feel like you're holding a lot of pain in your body, and that pain, especially today, and that pain has a manifestation in your body. People see it, and because you're sharing that pain, you actually get marginalized more. So if you express pain, you get sort of marginalized for expressing that pain, because maybe people want, happy, smiley faces or something. And it's like, so it's like grief. You can't even talk about this. You can't even share your true pain, because your pain, your honest pain, will be judged, and you'll be marginalized even more. So it's a vicious cycle of generating more and more of this pain.
Mm-hmm. And ironically, the main thing that I want to call attention to is the way that exactly this happens for people who are in classical categories of marginalization. You know, people of color in North America. My conversations with them, this is just the norm for them. They learn to hide what they're feeling because they have a sense that there's no chance whatsoever that when they speak out among white people that they'll be received in a way that is remotely empathic or really gets their experience.
So there's this is relating what you're sharing here about your own experience. You're seeing that relates to marginalized communities, African Americans or other communities that experience a general marginalization within society, and that they can, just like you, they cannot share their pain, because if they share their pain, they will be marginalized even more. So and this is kind of this whole issue for not just for yourself, but for others as well, is what you're trying to address and talk about and bring to awareness.
Yeah, and this whole conversation in the NVC community reflects this pattern. These conversations started when a non-white trainer expressed distress about some things that were going on in the network. And this was 2 to 3 years ago. And to this day, that person's concerns have not been addressed in any significant way. And what has happened is that the community has erupted in outrage about the language being used.
Okay, so you're saying that a couple of years ago there was a trainer who brought up this topic, and nobody really listened to what the trainer had to say, and it's just kind of created a whole outrage around it, instead of listening to that person, empathizing with them, I guess, in a sense, that it's just created this whole controversy and outrage about them sharing this pain and insight.
Yeah. So the dialogue, the dynamics in the NVC community are precisely demonstrating the problem that we're trying to call attention to.
Mm-hmm. So the same dynamics that are happening out into the wider society are happening within the NVC community. So even the NVC community is trying to address what's happening in the wider community, but it's happening within the NVC community as well.
Right. And so one place that I experienced some disconnect from words I've sometimes heard from Antonio is that he has framed this as being about a goal of social change. And it's possible that for some NVC trainers that may be the focus, but that's not my personal focus. My own focus is really supporting integrity in the NVC community around our claims to value, connection, and care for all.
Mm-hmm. So from Antonio, you feel that he's saying that this whole topic is around social change. How do we change society? And for you, it's really how to sort of manifest this empathic way of being, of mutual listening and care for each other.
Yeah, there might be some nuances, but that's pretty much it.
Is there more? Do you feel heard?
I think that's enough for now. Thank you.
Okay, well, I will speak back to you. I'm going to turn my camera on, and I have some anxiety that I get the blue screen of death. The whole computer crashes, so it's always on the edge. You know, is this going to crash? So I have a little bit of anxiety about that. If I disappear because of the video, that's what happened. So if you could just reflect that anxiety about the thing crashing.
Yeah, thanks. So you're nervous because your computer hasn't been behaving lately. You've been getting blue screens of death in the middle of fused conversations, and you'd love to just be able to focus on being in this experience and giving it your full attention without worrying about anything else.
Yeah, and I was really, I was sensing I got a lot of insight from what you were saying, about this dynamics. I've been aware of it, but hadn't heard it articulated so clearly about unless you're, very happy and, or look like you're really in charge of something, that you get kind of like marginalized as people like, oh, I don't want to be around this person because they look, stressed or something. And it just creates this, I'd been aware of it, but hadn't heard it articulated so clearly. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, so let me just catch that something clicked in you when you heard about my talking about the dynamics of how if you look stressed or in pain, people might think, I don't want to be around this person, and that could deepen the pain. That there's something that made sense to you about that.
Yeah. And the other thing that's coming up is this whole notion of privilege. I've had a really suspicious around the term and the experience of it. I took a mediation training here in Berkeley, about 7 years ago, where I heard the topic first come up. And the thing came up, it's like, now let's talk about our privilege. There's somehow this hierarchy of privilege, and where do you sit on this hierarchy of privilege? And my first reaction is this is like really, I feel a lot of tension in my body about this. This is not going to work. I want to create a culture of empathy. I want people to listen and empathize with each other. And I know, having grown up in a conservative environment, conservatives are not going to go for this. This is not going to work. And, I raised my concerns, and everybody was just it just created a really, intense environment. This was in a mediation workshop.
So let me see if I can catch some of this. That you're at a mediation workshop, and you heard them talking about privilege and trying to bring awareness to people, and there was a sense of it being about a hierarchy of privilege, and something about the way that things were being expressed stimulated some suspicion and tension in you, and just an intuitive, I don't think this is going to work. And you knew, for example, from growing up in a conservative community, you just couldn't imagine this beginning to be anything that could connect with people in that community. So
yeah, exactly. Right. And then the other thing is there was someone who then took on this privilege, said, oh yeah, I feel so horrible. I feel so guilty. I have all this privilege, and I feel so guilty for having it. And he just burst into tears, and the whole community, except me, kind of gathered around him to comfort him. And it just, I don't know, it just felt horrible. It's just like this whole guilt tripping kind of a thing. It just kind of just set me off. I just said, I just have a problem with this whole direction that this is going.
Yeah. So, is it that you see the privilege frame as being possibly intended to be about blame, but certainly stimulating guilt in people who take it seriously and see themselves as privileged, and just not liking that frame of, who's guilty.
Yeah, it's I guess I try to see that is that we have benefits from judgment. We're living in a judgmental environment, and privilege is how do you benefit from this judgment, that we all have different, and to create these broad categories of privilege, like white privilege and, all the different categories, sexism, privilege, or whatever, is having all these different categories. It's just not nuanced enough, for judgment. There's so many different forms of judgment, so many different things that, disconnect people. That for me, it's more kind of a positive to say, how might we create a more empathic society, and how might we, create the more connection and kind of approach it from that direction. And my thinking about all this is a little bit muddled still. I'm trying to work it through. So I appreciate this whole dialogue because of that.
Can I try to catch what I'm hearing now? And just so you know, I'm looking off to the side. I'm writing things down because my short-term memory isn't as sharp as it used to be, and it helps me to take some notes.
Mm-hmm. Totally understand.
So, yeah, this thing about I just want to be transparent that it's a little bit harder for me to reflect because I'm so not believing that having privilege has anything to do with judgments that you're making.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm hearing that you're having difficulty reflecting what I'm saying because what I'm saying doesn't seem to
match. But let me give this, with that disclaimer,
mm-hmm.
let me, Matt, say that. So you do have a sense that, the narrative of privilege is about how certain patterns of how people judge one another and may benefit from that judgment. And you see the framework as carving people into broad categories, where people in one category may judge people in another category. And for you, that just doesn't seem nuanced enough to reflect reality as you experience it. And you feel more hopeful on a more general frame for transforming judgments and moving in the direction of an empathic culture.
Yeah.
Like that?
Yeah, that's it. And with that, I feel I've said a lot, so I feel fully heard.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Antonio, what's up for you?
Hey,
you want to is okay. So just to stay within the format of Antonio, just reflect back what Bob says until he feels heard, and then.
Well, I guess is there a choice as to who speaks next?
It's your turn to speak. As the last person that listened, it's your turn to speak, and you can sort of pass it on. Say, "Hey, Tony, what's up for you?" And Tony says, "Oh, you're wondering what's up for me," and you say, "I feel fully heard," and then it kind of passes. So you just kind of.
Right, I get it.
Thank you, Edwin. I didn't know that about the format.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't explain it well.
That's cool.
So I'll do some reflecting, I guess, for you, Bob, if that.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, cool.
I felt kind of surprised and maybe illuminated by hearing Edwin talking about privilege as if it was about judgment. I was surprised by that because it's not at all the way I currently think about it. But it was illuminating as to, oh, of course someone would be skeptical of this from an NVC perspective if they thought that was what this was about. Would you just reflect that much?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm hearing you have some, I guess I would call it maybe some insight, maybe some new insight of a perspective around, you know, how somebody in the NVC community could see this conversation where it could be sort of like that I have self-judgments about myself because I'm thinking of my privileges, kind of. Does that kind of capture it?
Well, maybe. So I'm not sure how to frame this. It's the frame that I am imagining that Edwin might be thinking things are in, and in the frame that possibly some people who talk about issues of power or privilege may be in, and what may happen in some workshops that relate to these topics. There would be maybe two dimensions of judgment that people might think are going on or are actually going on. One would be thinking that the way that privilege happens is that, for example, white people judge black people and think that they're bad or something. And secondly, that the framework of talking about privilege is a framework that either has the intention or the effect of trying to tell people who have or are labeled as having privilege that they're bad and deserve to be judged.
Right.
And that they would be stimulated to, if they believe that, to feel guilty.
Cool. Maybe I'll reflect some of that. Yeah. So I'm hearing it's almost like you want to provide some clarity and some insight as to where you're seeing the conversation could go, which is two different places. It could go to the place where,
it's not about two different places that the conversation could go. It's about two different ways that judgment might be perceived to show up in relation to the concept of privilege.
I get it. Okay. Right. So in the conversation of privilege, these are the two ways that could show up, how the conversation shows up, kind of. So like, right, you're saying like one way is that we could start talking about the privilege that, for example, white people have compared to black people. Was that the first example that you gave?
Well, what I was actually saying is that the mechanism, to the extent that there's privilege is partially about some people being advantaged relative to other people. So they gain access to more of society's resources than other people do.
Right.
And if you think that that's about prejudice, for example, prejudice is a form of judgment. And so it's possible that in some people's minds saying that you have privilege might be synonymous with you're prejudiced.
Right.
You judge others.
Right. Right. And I'm hearing that maybe the clarity that you want to provide is that
I'm not to the clarity that I want to provide yet. I'm just trying to name what I'm perceiving as what other people might be thinking.
Oh, okay. Got it. All right. Right. So sort of like you're seeing how some people might be seeing this, where we could be talking about that you have privilege and that, quote, you shouldn't have privilege. Like it's a wrong thing to have privilege. And you could kind of like go into the idea of self-shaming oneself. Like, I shouldn't have more than other people, or it's wrong for me to have more than other people. And does that kind of capture it some more?
Yeah. Um, I didn't actually hear you reflect the part about people maybe having a story that privilege is about being prejudiced.
Right, right, exactly. So I'm hearing that that maybe there's a difference. Is that what it is? That there's a difference between how you could, how somebody could
Again,
look at.
I'm not offering my position at all yet. I'm just
Okay,
naming what I'm perceiving as
okay,
a narrative.
okay. So it's like, let me try this on. So it's when you're viewing somebody's experience of this conversation, they could be viewing it as having a conversation of prejudice, where you're having judgments about somebody. But what could be what the conversation could be about is about not the judgment of what, the color of your skin is, but maybe the advantages that you have or that a group of people have compared to other groups of people.
Yeah, I noticed that I'm feeling tired and hopeless about being reflected on this particular point.
I'm wondering if,
Do you want to just reflect his hopelessness?
yeah, yeah. I'm hearing, yeah, that you're having some weariness, some tiredness, and maybe not having the sense of recognition and understanding that you'd like to have around that specific part that you just talked about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a way that I'm willing to just drop it and move on. And at the same time, I'm a little bit curious like there in our conversations, Antonio, there's a lot that you've gotten, and I think that there are bits that you haven't gotten and don't get. And I'm curious to understand just what is it about certain things that they don't cross from me to you.
Maybe I'll give it a little reflection there.
Yeah, let's just keep reflecting.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm hearing, in some of the dialogue that you and I have had, there's been times where you feel like you've been gotten, your message has been received and reflected accurately. And then there's other times where that's not really your experience, that there isn't the understanding or the mutual shared understanding around other topics. Like that just hasn't happened at times.
Yeah.
And maybe you're trying to figure out what's going on there, like why there can't be that sense of recognition or understanding.
Yeah. So, I mean, this particular point of misunderstanding, it's not that I specifically need to be understood about this point in this moment, that it's the most important thing in the world. It's more just, I wonder if this offers any clues as to the more general other disconnects that may be more critical.
Right. Right. So you're saying, it's kind of like with what happened a few moments ago. You're wondering if this has some insight as to the challenges around having some mutual understanding, that with certain topics it might be hard to really get the empathy that you're looking for, or just the reflection that you're looking for.
And I want to clarify that I'm not looking for empathy for the sake of my feeling better or my personal healing. I'm looking for empathy because I view empathy as a deep practice for achieving mutual understanding. And I'm longing for mutual understanding.
Yeah. So really, empathy for you around this topic is has a lot to do with just being gotten, so that there's a mutual understanding around the care that you have for this topic.
I'm pausing to kind of re-center myself a little. I'm surprised because this has been like one of the most difficult interchanges I've had with you in our 5 hours of conversation.
Mm. Yeah, I'm hearing maybe some disappointment, some frustration.
No, I don't. I'm just in the wondering of what it's all about.
Mm.
So I want to come back and, rather than trying to pursue the line that I was in, name a couple of things that respond to what I was hearing in Edwin's narrative. One is that I don't know if you've ever used giraffe and jackal puppets in, teaching NVC. I don't routinely do that, but I've done it and I've seen it. Mm. And I know that some of the more recent generations of jackal puppets, they took to adding a heart on the jackal. And the intention of that was to remind people that even if someone is speaking in a way that is a little bit hard to receive, there's a precious heart inside it.
Yeah. So I'm hearing in the teaching of NVC, using the hand puppets of jackal and giraffe, there has now been the addition of adding the heart to the jackal as a way of being able to express that beyond what the jackal is expressing. There's a life there. There's a heart.
Yeah. And so when Edwin talked about how painful his experience, I added the word pain, but it was not something that he was enthusiastic about what he saw at this workshop where privilege was brought into the conversation. That makes sense to me. That's not at all what I want. But for me, terms like privilege are terms that can show up and be expressed both in jackal consciousness and which also have expressions in giraffe consciousness.
Yeah. So sounds like you're having some resonance with Edwin's experience, that you wouldn't want that experience to be had in a workshop about privilege. And also that the idea of privilege can be taken in either a giraffe context or a jackal context.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like for me, it's a little bit similar to the idea of responsibility is an idea that has both a jackal version and a giraffe version, a domination paradigm version and a partnership paradigm version. In the old paradigm, responsibility is about figuring out who is to blame, who gets punished or rewarded based on what happened. And that's not a notion of responsibility that I want to have anything whatsoever to do with.
Right. So it's, yeah. Even with the idea of responsibility, we could take that in either context, where in the jackal context, we're trying to figure out who's to blame for not having responsibility. However, it's not really the place that you're coming from, even with the word of responsibility.
Yeah. And in my NVC understanding of responsibility is about where, if I focus my attention on this and think of this as my job, are things likely to go more smoothly, and is life likely to be more wonderful? It's about opportunities for making life more wonderful.
Yeah. So the conversation really for you is shifting away from blame to how is it that I can make life more wonderful, instead of looking for blame.
So when I have in the past used the word privilege, it's been in a way that has a shift similar to the way that shift in the word responsibility happens. Yes, privilege can be used in a jackal way, in a domination paradigm way that is about blame and figuring out who's right and wrong and who needs to repent for the evils of their way. And I want nothing whatsoever to do with that. And that's not what I or my perception of what my colleagues who care about this work in the NVC world want to bring.
Yeah, that's right. That idea of of having the conversation of privilege is not around shaming or blaming, and it's not even the context in which the colleagues that you're working with this topic around are motivated in having a discussion around.
Yeah. It's, I mean, a lot of the social justice movement and doctrine, I mean, it developed in the mainstream culture, which is a culture steeped in domination paradigm ways of thinking and talking about things. And so some of what is present in parts of the social justice movement reflects a blame and judgment mindset.
Right. Right. Yeah. So I'm hearing, in a way, mainstream culture has really developed the idea, of the sort of like the social system that we have now.
That's not quite landing. The social justice movement, like any other movement, is a mix of people. And many of them only had the tools of jackal culture for expressing what was important to them. And so there are people in that community who express themselves in jackal ways because how else would they express themselves? It's what they know.
Okay, I'll try that again. It sounds like right. The social justice movement, right? People in the social justice movement the way that they might be, right, some people in the social justice movement might be trying to create social justice from more of a right-wrong type of stance. Yeah.
And there are also some deep thinkers in the social justice movement who are not coming from that place, who I believe are philosophically very aligned with NVC in the way that they hold these concepts.
Right. So there are, sort of like to your recollection that there are some social justice people who are trying to create some, I guess, social change, who are involved with NVC, who are not working off of the right wrong.
Not necessarily. I'm talking people who are not necessarily involved with NVC.
Oh, okay.
But they just, for their own reasons, they have a philosophic orientation that is quite compatible with NVC.
Right. So, right. There's some social justice people who are, they're not NVC trained, but they're not working off of the right wrong idea.
Exactly.
Which could be considered to be in alignment, sort of like with NVC principles.
And they're not the loudest voices, the voices that people encounter most often, unfortunately.
Right. Right. So, yeah, there might not, I guess, be that much awareness that there's people like this who are working not with the right wrong paradigm.
Yeah. And collectively, people who've worked in that realm have identified ideas and insights that I think are really helpful as long as one very carefully prunes off any of the jackal thinking layers and just finds the tender heart of something that's really beautiful and valuable. And my experience is that's the project that I and my colleagues as NVC trainers are involved in. We're taking these insights that are really precious and we're peeling away the layers that are not so helpful. They may be expressed in life alienating ways. And we're doing our best to share the tender heart of what is there.
Yeah. Yeah. So in your line of work with working on this topic and along with your colleagues, you're really, it sounds like really having a lot of awareness to not include right-wrong thinking when you're sharing about this topic in ways that could be life alienating.
Yeah. Feel torn. Let me just squeeze in one more piece. So in what Edwin said, I thought I heard a perception that privilege was about prejudice. And one of the beautiful insights that people who've worked in this field have come to over the years, maybe 50 years ago, people who were looking at this thought that it was mostly about prejudice. And more people are thinking prejudice is like the least important part of this subject in some ways.
Okay, let me try reflecting that. And what you heard from Edwin, it sounded like there was the idea that privilege has to do with prejudice.
Yeah.
Right, but I guess I'm hearing that people who have been studying this for a while are seeing that there are two different topics, so to say.
Yeah, that prejudice, may be one contributor to patterns of privilege, but it's almost the least important part at this point in time.
Right. So, right. So sort of like what some of the people who've been studying this for a while are finding, that maybe prejudice contributes to privilege. However, that might not be the most important thing to focus on.
Right. Okay, I think that's enough for now. Thank you.
Yeah, just sitting here, checking in with my experience.
Who would you like to be heard by?
I'll let's see. Let me just check in. Yeah, wondering if Edwin would be up for doing some reflecting.
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. Yeah, I'm a bit miffed, taken aback. I guess hearing Bob's experience of just not having, the understanding and the shared understanding that he wanted around the subject. Just noticing that, it's just maybe not sitting too well with me. I guess it's a bit of discomfort, some confusion, wanting clarity. Feeling a bit uneasy about that.
We could reflect that. So you're feeling uneasy because you heard Bob say he wasn't getting the shared understanding that he was wanting, and you're feeling uneasy about it, feeling miffed about it, just maybe some discomfort, or a lot of things are coming up around that.
Yeah. Yeah, I just feel a bit of disconnect there. I don't know exactly why, but I think it maybe has to do with wanting clarity. Some more clarity, I'd say. I think I got the clarity of how that was affecting him, and maybe the clarity that I'm looking for is just around wanting to maybe figure out where the disconnect was. So
So you heard Bob say he wasn't being heard the way he wanted to be heard, and that was creating discomfort in you, and kind of wanting a sense of clarity of what that means, and actually feeling miffed about it, and feeling a sense of disconnection around that, and kind of what does this really mean? Like, what does all this mean?
Yeah, and I can feel some openness now as I'm seeing how that affected me. Having a little bit more presence. And having some hope for some connection around that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so hearing that, you kind of felt closed off, disconnected, and now by being able to share those feelings of, feeling disconnected, it's kind of opening you up again, and you're creating more hope because you're able to share those feelings.
Yeah, and even the hope of creating connection and understanding around that topic. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's like this whole meaning of, I don't feel heard the way I want to be heard. And it felt maybe hopeless in a sense, but you're starting to feel a little bit of sense of of hope, like understanding what that really means and what that's all about.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess having some clarity and some hope around really being able to like address it and maybe get back to mutual understanding. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like that was a feeling that it didn't have mutual understanding, and it sounded like you would like mutual understanding.
Yeah.
And want to have some hope that mutual understanding is possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of like what's most alive for me. Checking in to see if there's anything else alive for me around this, or really around anything.
It sounds like there's still a lot of pain around that, and you're kind of looking what comes up next.
Yeah. I think, the one thing that I guess I just have some confusion around in the topic of privilege as it's being discussed is what's the outcome? What's the call to action? And I think that's kind of like what I've been maybe missing. It's like I had, I've gone to discussions about topics in general. It's like in high school, I had the debate club, and it was a form of having discussion. There wasn't necessarily sort of like a detailed outcome of what would happen from that. It was exploratory, is what I would call it, to explore different points of views. And even when I look at something like NVC, the outcome there is to have connection. It doesn't mean connection with someone. It means connection. And that's what my understanding of NVC is. It's like, of just kind of like creating understanding. Like, I can totally understand, what's going on for someone. Doesn't mean, that I'm going to agree with what they're doing. I don't agree with going to war. I understand it. And that's sort of like what NVC gave me, was that tool to be able to really have some empathy and possibly have compassion for the pain that someone's going through. And maybe I'll just finish it off with this little thought, which is that, living in a place like Harlem, which could be considered to be a marginalized community, has, these NVC skills have given me the ability to see that I get it. It's not an individual issue. However, right, it's not an individual issue when somebody, when their issues are just not maybe taken as seriously as a member of Harlem, because of their background. Maybe they're Black, maybe they're poor. And so maybe their concerns are just not taken into much consideration because of that. And as a member myself of this community, and as what I would call myself a representative of this community, I do listen to the person on a one-on-one level. That is kind of like what NVC has given me. And as well, I do sometimes really take this to a social change level where, look, if the street has potholes, it's affecting everybody, right? If your house is falling down and it's been falling down for a while and it's not being repaired, it's affecting more than just that one person. You know, and yes, it's like, might your claims be mitigated because of your background, whether it's race or class? It sure might be. And for me, the work has been to, right, not, again, look at class level or look at anybody as to why this is happening. It's a matter of, I don't ask the why. Not all the time. I want to go ahead and figure out what can we do to make life more wonderful.
Well, I can reflect that if you're ready.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think the first part I was hearing is you were wondering about the privilege discussion, like where does it go? You want a sense of moving towards greater understanding and the sense of connection, and you're not seeing how the privilege discussion leads to that. And for you, the meaning that NVC has had is it's giving you a way to connect individually with people in a sense that leads towards understanding of others, you know, why they might want to go to war or something, or whatever, that you might not agree with them, but that you would have more understanding, and that understanding creates a sense of connection. Even if you don't agree with the person, there's still a sense of connection. And that you also have there's sort of an individual connecting at an individual level with someone. But then you also see that there is this relevance to, you know, groups, like, you know, it could be the Black or Hispanic, whatever, or communities, like in Harlem or wherever it is, that you can see that there is some, you know, group, you know, understanding and connection there too. But it's, yeah, so that was sort of what I was getting. You're kind of like, it's not really totally clear, but it's kind of, you have general ideas about this. But it's really about that understanding, connection, and moving towards something, and maybe even having some shared actions together is,
yeah,
kind of, you know, fix the potholes or something.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's almost like I guess maybe this is just, you know, my personal focus in a way. There are, you know, I think many groups of people of so many different backgrounds whose pain is not being heard. I agree with that. And I might be in that system, as a matter of fact. You know, if I break down my race and my gender, you know, literally, I mean, my gender, you know, has a 94% mortality rate for on-the-job deaths. And it's like, I could say, you know, wow, you know, men are being, you know, they're being mitigated for their lives. Their lives are being mitigated, you know, or we're being marginalized. It's like, we haven't had a lower 90% death rate for on-the-job deaths. Like 94% of men die on the job. And that's been a statistic that has been alive for more than 20 years. And so it's like, you know, my concern is around focusing on, you know, sort of like, well, you know, who's doing this or who's causing this? Is it women? Because I could easily take the focus and say, well, you know, it seems like, you know, this group of people is causing this onto this other group of people. And for me, I really just come back to, I just want to hear the hearts. I just want to hear the pain. It's weird, but I am a fan of pain. I am a fan of my pain, of hearing everybody's pain, so that we can figure out what to do. And I agree, you know, with what Bob said, where I think we were talking about this last week, where sometimes this is not on an individual level. And if you look at 94% of men being killed on the job, that's not in an individual case. And so my thing is, well, what are we going to do? And how are we going to create a world that works for everybody? Because that doesn't work for me, to see that 94% of men die on the job, or that over 93% of men are in jail. It seems like the odds are stacked against me. And so it's like, right, I could look at that and start, if I'm a woman, start looking at the privilege that I have, right? And I get it. I could easily go down the path. And I think this is where it becomes sort of like a slippery slope for me, where I agree, it could easily become a slippery path of going into judgment, of self-judgment, or of judgment of other groups. Like, well, why do women why are women so safe on the job, and why don't they die so often on the job, or why aren't they in prison? And I could easily look at, you know, seeing that it could be taken into the light of right and wrong. And my concern is that it could so easily be taken into that context. And I agree that these are issues, you know, to really bring to the surface. And I'm not sure, and I haven't really heard that all marginalization issues are being taken into account when I hear about these workshops. I mean, right, you could say that I've had microaggressions towards me because people have started talking to me in Spanish because they look at me and they think that I speak Spanish, you know? And so it's like, it seems like there's so many issues that could be taken into the light of privilege that my concern is that it could become political correctness conversation. And I know that, right, I'm hearing from Bob that this is not the focus. However, for me, it's such a slippery slope as to which direction that somebody might take this in, that I'm considering that to be a very big risk to take. And that's my concern.
Okay, so I'm hearing you have a concern about the privilege discussion because it could be a slippery slope, that you see that that males have pain, and you started off by talking about pain. It's like there's pain in all these different communities. You know, males have pain. That do women have actually more privilege than men actually because they're not dying as much on the job, and it can be a whole slippery slope about, you know, who has privilege, where is privilege, and you know, and so forth. And so so I was hearing it was about pain. You can, you know, groups maybe have pain, but also you can see individuals have pain, and it's like you want to go to the pain and hear the pain and see the pain, and that the privilege it's kind of, I guess there's a complication of, you know, who has privilege, who is not, and how do you slice and dice it, and it could be just a slippery slope versus just going to people's pain and addressing that. I don't know if I was getting that.
Yeah. And I want to be clear that when I say I go to to the pain, for me, it's like going to the source. What happens to me? Like, my mom's been called Mexican. She's not Mexican, and she laughs about it every time. And she gets home and she cracks up. She's like, "You wouldn't believe what happened to me again today." and it's like, I don't want to group this as like, wow, it happened again. Wow, that's fucked up. I don't, because that didn't actually happen. As it turns out, in my mom's experience, she found humor in that. And as it turns out for me, depending on, on the context, at times that I might take it with a little bit more pain, hearing that. Right. And so it's like, I kind of come back to this idea of like, well, in this instance, my mom had some met needs for humor, as it turns out, and it didn't really affect her, didn't create pain for her. And there's been so many times, right, in a place like this where, right, anyways, there's so many examples that I can single out from my mom of being able to, say, look, yes, could it be an instance, right? And this is sort of like the thing for me is like, I could argue for days as to whether somebody is marginalized or not. Like, and I think that's the pain for me, is that I could say my mom wasn't marginalized. She laughed about that. I hear something.
I don't know how to fit into this format, but it's becoming increasingly difficult for me to listen to this.
Yeah, if you can just kind of sit with it, in terms of until Antonio feels heard, then we'll come back around to everyone gets a chance to be fully heard in the process eventually. So what I was hearing is that it's like different people deal with the pain or potential pain. It might not even be pain. So if your mother is being, spoken to in Spanish, and instead of taking it and being pained by it, she just makes fun of it. And so how do you kind of address, going down this route, to turning everything into a privileged discussion or something like that? There's other ways of dealing with these issues. I don't know.
Yeah.
Is that getting there?
Yeah, I think that's it. I'm feeling some concern jumping out of me, wanting to turn some attention to Bob. And I will say I'm feeling heard, and I'm also just wanting to have a sense of awareness and care. And I'm concerned right now. I would like to see, out of a sense of care, if there's maybe a potential to hear what's going on for Bob. And I know that we have a system here where Edwin would now talk to somebody, and I'm wondering if, out of a sense of care, if we could maybe listen to what's going on for Bob.
Mm-hmm. So you're wanting a sense of care, and you're hearing that Bob would like to speak, and you would like to have care for him and his concerns, and wondering if we could bring the attention to him, or that he gets a chance to speak.
Yeah. Thank you.
Feel complete? Okay.
Yeah.
So it's my turn, I guess, and I'll speak to Bob.
Okay.
And I kind of was coming up for me with some of my feelings around these topics. So there was a conservative group coming to Berkeley to demonstrate, and then the progressive community kind of rose up, and they were doing all these different events, to respond to them. And I went to a progressive church, And it was a very social justice oriented church. And they had, at least the group that was there, they had a rule that as a white male, anybody could cut in front of you. I mean, if you were a woman or, person of color, that anybody could cut in front of you to speak because, they want to, I don't know, whatever, because of this, privilege, social justice, sort of mindset. That's kind of where it is they were turning over the hierarchy. And it felt really horrible. I mean, I felt like really constricted. I felt like, I was marginalized. It just wasn't, so it was kind of my experience of kind of the social justice, community, at least one of them.
Yeah, so I'm hearing that in this progressive church, men were the bottom of the barrel. And it didn't feel very good the way that they were holding this. And that's what you associate with at least some aspects of social justice. Yeah,
and I was doing a mediation at in the empathy tent that we set up at the Battles of Berkeley. And I'm sitting there with a person, one of the leaders of the right wing, and then someone who is on the left. We're trying to do an empathy circle, just like we're doing here. And, the anti-fascists, and it's very much, around the social justice community, basically shouted us down. It's like they just came, they tried to push in, they were screaming and yelling. And we even invited them to sit down and have a dialogue, and they would not dialogue. They just wanted to shut us down. We don't want any, these are, fascists, and we're just going to shut them down. So, I mean, these are, and that felt pretty horrible too. It's like this dialogue, just this shutting down, which maybe you're calling marginalization. But so that was another kind of experience.
Yeah, so you had an experience of people being shouted down and certain views not being able to be expressed, and associating that with people who identify with the social justice movement.
Yeah, and I do hear from you that there's different, within the privilege discussion, there's those who are wanting to use it for connection and understanding and mutuality, and that there's others who want to use it within the top-down hierarchical. So you do see two different, within this one word, that there's two different ways of using it and different intentions. And so I do understand that. But I really see that, I just see that the word is associated with all these experiences that I have, which are kind of painful and, intimidating and so forth.
Yeah, so you heard that my sense that the word can be used in different frameworks, and that there might be an NVC aligned way of using the word, but other people have used it in ways that are really painful, and those associations come to mind when you hear that.
Yeah, and I wonder if maybe a more effective direction would be to be talking about how do we create an empathic culture? How do we hear each other? And within that context, that whatever comes up can bubble up, but we have that empathic, space that we're forming as a container to hold, all this pain. So how do we create that empathic container? And I see kind of what we're doing here is kind of trying to create, a little culture of empathy in a container.
So you have this question of, it makes sense to you that maybe it would be more effective to get the end result that we want by focusing on creating an empathic culture, and a culture where people would really listen to each other.
Yeah. I feel heard. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, Edwin, I'd like to ask you to reflect me.
Okay.
Hmm. I guess I'm partially just reflecting on how this topic seems to be fundamentally about the failure of empathy, and the conversations that arise in the NVC community I've experienced as profoundly lacking in empathy.
So you're noticing that there's been a lack of empathy in the way this, you know, in the community, in NVC community, how this topic's been addressed. So there's kind of like an empathy shortage around this.
A while back, I read an article in, I think it was the New York Times Magazine, that claimed that this person had the position that he thought that the effort to teach empathy people empathy skills to promote peace was somewhat misguided. And this person's position was, the problem isn't that people can't do empathy, the problem is that they shut off their empathy skills in certain conditions. And we need to be focusing at why and when does our capacity for empathy get shut off. And my experience is that people's capacity for empathy gets shut off around this topic within the NVC community and in other places.
So this article was talking about empathy, and it was about like about how empathy gets shut off. Like, at what point does empathy get shut off? How and why? And that's kind of like where you're looking at. It's like how and why this empathy gets shut off in different around different topics.
Well, and that we're not likely to be able to create the peace that we want in the world if we just look at empathy skills, but at what gets in the way of those empathy skills being applied is.
So you can teach empathy skills, and you have to kind of go beyond just empathy skills. So we need to be looking like, when does the actual empathy kind of shut down? At what point? What is it that's maybe triggering that empathy to shut down in people?
Yeah, because my sense is that the whole debate about whether these topics have a place in NVC is a debate that has been shutting down empathy in people who have capacity for empathy.
Mm-hmm. So NVC is about people who have capacity for empathy, and they have. But it's been, the discussion has been getting shut down because something is like triggering a lack of empathy within the NVC community. Somehow that empathy is kind of missing within the NVC community around these topics.
Yeah. I mean, look at this. I've never experienced the community as being more polarized than when certain trainers decided to try to draw attention to the suffering of some people. And the result has been enormous suffering. And trying to bring the subject up has stimulated a lot of suffering in me, and a sense of, I'm astonished at how little NVC skills have been used in the larger public dialogue about this topic. There's something about this topic that shuts down people's empathy skills. And I think that matters.
Mm-hmm. So there's something you're just like, there's almost like astonishment that something about this topic, even within, I mean, a larger society, but in NVC is shutting down empathy. It's just shutting off empathy, and almost like an astonishment that this happens.
The other thing that it seems to shut down is self-responsibility. For me, self-responsibility is one of the cornerstones of practicing NVC, and it doesn't work without self-responsibility. And I'm just astonished by what I interpret personally as a complete lack of self-responsibility in many of those who are complaining about what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. So like core to this is being self-responsible. And you're seeing that the people who are complaining about what you're doing are just not being responsible for their role in it.
Yeah. So to address maybe two different things. One, Edwin, I hear your question of, couldn't we just focus on creating an empathic culture? Yes, and I think that maybe we need to put a different label on it. But what I and my colleagues am trying to bring in bringing up subjects of how different categories of people have different experiences, for me, that's mostly about fixing a deficit in the way that we are currently teaching empathy. That the way that we currently teach empathy often results in a lack of empathy for people in different categories than our own. Could you reflect that?
Yeah, so what you're actually trying to do is create a more empathic culture, and this is how you're trying to address it, that the way that empathy training is done, that it's actually not fostering empathy in certain communities, and you're trying to, and there's like a deficit in the approach, and you're trying to find a way to actually increase empathy in these communities. Like, hey, I want to create more empathy for these communities that our training is somehow not really reaching.
Not in these communities, but in cross-community interactions.
Okay.
So, for example, people of color have told me that they've had painful, alienating experiences when they have gone to NVC trainings or NVC community events. And I don't think that most white participants at these events get why what is happening is painful and alienating to people of color who are there.
Mm-hmm. So people of color who have come to NVC events, that they feel alienated and in pain, and that the white community is not really understanding that and why that is so. And that's what you're trying to address?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
There's something wrong with the picture. I mean, NVC at its best means that I can walk up to another person who has some NVC background, and within 5 minutes, we are having a deeply satisfying connection. heart to heart, human to human, that in the rest of the world, before I learned NVC, I could have gone years without having an interaction like that. And now it's just this like nectar from the gods that's freely available. And there's something wrong with the picture when a community that is dedicated to a practice that can have this effect is frigging alienating to people. There's something wrong here that needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. So you're noticing that when you meet other people in the NVC community, you can have very deeply connecting, meaningful connections, but there's sort of something there's a feeling of alienation with people outside of that, and that there's something...
Not with people outside of that. I'm saying that people who have certain experiences, like the experiences that Black Americans have, when they come to NVC communities, often feel alienated. And that is, there's something wrong with the picture of a practice that is about ending alienation, actively alienating people.
So there's something wrong in the picture here if the process is about overcoming alienation, not alienating people, and it is alienating certain groups, in this case, African Americans or the Black community. There's something wrong in the picture. There's something, it's like maybe kind of almost like getting a sense of searching. You're like searching for like, what is the problem here, and maybe looking for what the solution, or even articulating what the problem is.
I'm not actually personally searching for the problem anymore. I feel pretty darn clear on it. And I'm just tearing my hair out with frustration that the community thinks I'm the devil for trying to help around this issue.
Okay, so you actually feel like a sense of clarity around what the problem is, and when you try to share that the community kind of reacts negatively towards you, and you're like ready to pull your hair out of frustration. It's just like feeling frustrated.
And it's not even when I interact with people about the issue that they react. It's the rumor of what they think that I might be doing with others.
So they're not even seeing what it is that you're really doing. It's just they're hearing it secondhand, and that secondhand rumor is like really upsetting people and triggering them. And
yeah, I mean, people are saying privilege isn't an observation, how you're not honoring the practice of NVC by not focusing on observations, and they're not actually making any observations in their own discourse and their own expressions of upset.
So they're not even really observing. I mean, they're not even observing and being. Yeah, I didn't know if I quite got that. They're not observing what you're doing. They're not seeing what actually. They're not actually empathizing with what you're doing.
And this kind of comes to why I was so frustrated when Antonio was speaking. My main goal here is I just want the people who want to work on this to be left in peace to do what they're passionate about doing in NVC settings. This has to be in NVC settings because it's about a fucking defect in the NVC community. It doesn't make sense to say take it somewhere else because it's about something that is happening in the NVC community that is creating unnecessary suffering.
So you're seeing like in the community, in the process of NVC, that there's a defect. And so you're trying to address this defect. in NVC. So you can't like take it outside of the process, because it is actually trying to heal or repair or improve the NVC process. And so it belongs in NVC because that's what you're trying to fix.
Yeah. It's not that the process, the NVC process itself is defective. It's that it's maybe incomplete in some ways that allow bad things to happen in NVC communities.
Yeah, so there might be something in addition to the process that needs to be added to improve it and make it more effective.
To allow those who practice it to more consistently achieve the sort of outcomes that the practice is intended to support happening.
Yeah, so it's like you don't want to, like the African American community, when they come into the community, you don't want them to feel alienated, or other communities when they come in. You know, you're seeing that they're feeling alienated, and you're trying to address that and see how you might be able to address that and make them feel welcome, and a sense of connection happens.
So that they can experience the sort of deep empathy flowing easily in a way that many of the rest of us get to experience when we're in this community.
So you would like to have them have the same experience that brings you so much joy, which is this sense of deep connection, and you're trying to make them feel welcome and, you know, find a way of bringing them into that beautiful, welcoming, connecting feeling.
Well, and it's not just about them. It's about wanting to be in integrity with myself. That it's kind of funny to say it when I'm in a place that includes maybe some anger. I so want to be an agent of love in this world, to have people experience my words and actions as things that contribute to their sense of there being more love in the world. Love that has room for them in it.
Yeah, so you would like to be seen that you're contributing towards more love in the world, love towards them, and also seeing a little bit of the irony that you're saying this while you have some anger too, and seeing a little irony. I don't know if it's irony, but
yeah. And I get nervous because it's not about taking care of other people. It's partially about being in integrity, about contributing to life on this planet in the way that I want to be showing up. I want to be showing up in a way that I've got the capacity to contribute equally to making life more wonderful for a rich white guy and, you know, a poor black woman, Muslim woman or something, you know.
So you'd like to really contribute to everyone. I mean, kind of equally to, no matter what their class or background is. And so you just have that sense of contribution to everyone equally. And there's an integrity, to be in integrity with that.
And I want our community to have that sort of consistency as well. I want the NVC community to be equally welcoming to people across a wide variety of life experiences.
Okay, so the vision you have for the NVC community is to be open to everyone and inviting to everyone and loving with everyone. And I mean, that's sort of like the feeling and vision you have for the community.
Yeah, and there is this kind of hidden thing going on where I think much of the community thinks that they're already pretty close to that. And they don't see the way that the community is not that for some people.
Mm-hmm. So people think that it's already a loving, caring community, and you think they don't realize that it's not that for everyone, that there's people who don't have that experience.
Yeah. So when we try to call out, that's maybe not the right word. I think that when we bring in topics like talking about the way different categories of people are treated differently, people experience that as rocking the boat and destabilizing something that in their experience is pretty close to perfect, or it's pretty darn good. And they're worried that what we're doing will make it less good. But what they're not tracking is that it's been pretty darn good for quite a few people, and then there's a certain category of people for whom it's been awful. And they're not getting that something needs to change for this to not be awful for some people.
Mm-hmm. So you're sort of putting yourself in the shoes of others who are not really realizing that you're putting in the shoes of others who think, hey, this is pretty good. This NVC, this community is pretty good. But those people are not putting themselves into the shoes of still other people who say this is not so good and is actually awful. And so you would like those people to put themselves in the shoes of the people who think this is pretty awful. So why don't you think about them seeing this as being kind of an awful community, or this is an awful experience?
Yeah. So that's why it's so upsetting. Well, I spoke a while recently to a colleague who shared an experience of, this person was in Europe, and they said that there had been, as refugees started flooding in from, war zones maybe in the Mideast, I'm not sure where, that there was a proposal to house some of these refugees in school gymnasiums. And people said, oh, we can't do that. Our kids need to be able to do their sports programs and things. Terrible idea. Forget it. And for this person, there was just like don't you see that these people have had their whole lives uprooted, that this is almost a matter of survival for them, and you're giving priority to things that have importance, but they're not on the same scale as human tragedy. And yet you're prioritizing these comforts of life in a wealthy country.
Maybe I could say, are you in a sense asking Antonio to put himself in the shoes of people who are not feeling welcome in the NVC community?
Yeah. Like, I get that there are reasons for concern about ways that working with these topics could go bad if it's not done with sufficient skill. And I'm constantly learning about that, and it gives me hope for future workshops doing even better at avoiding any likelihood of that happening. But it's just not a balanced conversation when there's no acknowledgement that what is going on right now just deeply does not work for some people.
So you'd really like acknowledgement from Antonio that, hey, this is not working for some people. and that you're trying to learn better on how to make it work for other people, but you're kind of like asking him to kind of acknowledge that it doesn't work for others. For some others, yeah, for some communities.
Yeah. And, you know, it's Antonia is the one who's here. But, you know, this.
Yeah, it's like Antonio's here, so he's getting this request. You're requesting it sort of others too, just not him, but just because he's here, he kind of gets that request.
Yeah.
Feel heard?
Pretty much. I just want to come back to this one piece of Antonio in particular. This might be a slight exaggeration. I hear that you've talked to people who've gone to trainings and listened to some. But the story that I'm telling myself is that your opposition to this work is entirely based on your fantasies. It's not based on reality.
Yeah, so you're telling yourself that Antonio's, you know, not having opposition to this work is just based on sort of his imagination of what's going on instead of actual experiences that are happening. So there's like a divorce from the real experience. And that's maybe why he doesn't understand it. If he'd have real experience, then maybe he would understand it. And yeah.
So, like in his interview with you and starting in some of what he said today, I hear him talking about all these things that he doesn't like, and none of the things that he doesn't like are things that I'm advocating for. So what does that have to do with his opposing my work?
Mm-hmm. So the things you're hearing him be opposed to, it's like they're not things that you support. It's like, yeah. So why is he opposing your work when the things that he's criticizing isn't what you're doing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's complete.
Okay. Then I'll speak to Antonio.
Cool.
Kind of torn between turning the video on or off because it's crashing. I'm going to try it. Please don't crash. I talk. One thing that was coming to me about what Bob was saying is about the self-responsibility. So when I was at the church, I felt, and they were saying, okay, you're the last in line, right? Because you're a male. It's like there is a certain self-responsibility in that. How do I approach that painful situation with empathy? Yeah. So I do see that it's hard. You got to have resilience, and so I do understand that I do have a role in that environment.
Yeah, maybe I'll just reflect that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, and hearing Bob talk about the self-responsibility part, there's some resonance there for you, because in the example of the church, for you, it's sort of like, well, how do I actually go ahead and have some advocacy for myself, which is something that, it's sort of like, right, how can I do that? But you have some resonance there with the idea of having self-responsibility in this conversation, kind of.
Exactly. And in the other situations too, it's not just I would say it's how do the self-responsibility is kind of my sense of wanting to empathize in those environments. Like, how do I empathize with those people, the people who are creating this structure? How do I empathize with the people who are trying to shut down our empathy circle in the empathy tent? How do I have a whole, in the workshop I did, the mediation, it's like, how do I come into that with a more empathic listening, presence myself, instead of getting kind of constricted in myself and kind of wanting to lash back and say, you guys are full of shit here and what you're doing. So I do see that it's difficult. It's because it's a painful, situation. And I feel like I'm demeaned or, put down or not heard myself,
Right. So it's almost like in the instances of, like, for example, with the anti-fascists, taking down your tent, or in the instance of being in that workshop for you, it's like, you really want to have some curiosity of how to have some more maybe empathic listening, and sort of like some empathic action to take.
Mm-hmm. And presence and action, yeah.
Right, so that it's not just a reaction to you being mitigated and you not being heard, but it's really coming from a place that's, maybe I'm hearing, more heart-centered, so to say, kind of.
I would say more empathically centered, just really
centered.
that. And part of what we're doing here, listening to each other, we're going over our time. I hope that's okay. I can keep going. Is, it's this is what kind of helps build my resilience. We're going through this tough stuff. We're listening. So this kind of builds my resilience for going into those difficult situations too.
Right. So it's almost like the ongoing practice of empathic listening really, in a way, builds up some muscle, some skill for you to be able to go ahead and have some empathic listening and empathic action in situations like that. Yeah.
And the other thing that comes up is, when Bob was talking about, this was kind of sitting with me when Bob was talking about not being heard by you, and it sounded like it was, you're feeling uncomfortable about it. There is a sense of responsibility too, that if you don't feel heard, it's your responsibility to express yourself in a way that you feel heard too. So I see that also. That's another aspect, right? There's responsibility. You are not being heard. Somehow the way I'm describing it, you're not able to hear it. What can I do to have you feel heard to my satisfaction?
Right. So it's almost like when you heard Bob say that he just was having a hard time being heard by me. For you, what showed up was sort of like, maybe like a sense of curiosity. Like, well, if that's happening to me, the sense of self-responsibility shows up of, what can I do to be heard? What can I, how can I, what can I do here to actually have that recognition of my words and of my experience?
Yeah, and I find it difficult to hear people sometimes when they're talking in multiple perspectives. It's like there's my perspective, I'm taking the perspective of someone else, and there's multiple perspectives, and when it gets to multiple perspective, it's kind of like harder to comprehend. It takes more concentration to kind of shift perspectives. So I get kind of lost in that myself sometimes too.
So in the dynamic of having to really empathize with multiple people, there's a bit of a challenge there for you, where you're not entirely clear of how to have that balance to empathically hold space for everybody.
No, it's when somebody is speaking and they're speaking about somebody else's perspective.
Oh, got it. Okay.
See, it's like Bob is saying, well, take the perspective of someone who's coming into this situation, which they feel uncomfortable. So he's not saying his own personal experience. He's talking about shifting your perspective to be in their shoes. And it's valid and, fine to say that, but it can be a little difficult to follow.
Right. Okay. So for you, it's a little challenging to maybe stay focused or have some empathy for somebody when they're asking somebody to try on somebody else's experience, kind of.
Right. It's cognitively a little bit difficult, but it's all valid by just saying that there is a little bit of difficulty in that. So.
Right.
I guess I want to just share it. That was my feelings about it. I get lost sometimes too. Yeah.
Right. So in that situation that you were talking about, you kind of get confused and a little lost in trying to figure out and follow.
And be able to reflect that. Yeah.
Right. And be able to reflect it.
Yeah, I feel heard. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Noticing a little bit of hunger showing up in my stomach, so I just want to see, do we want to go another 10 minutes? What's the sense of I think I have 10 minutes left in me. Does that work?
Works for me.
Okay. Is there a way to finish, Edwin, or?
Just there's no, usually I light a candle with setting our intention to build a culture of empathy, then we blow it out at the end. So,
okay.
You know, but
yeah.
I didn't start that way, so.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Just wanted to be clear. So I guess I talk and I get reflection from you, Edwin?
Whoever you want to speak to, you're
okay. Okay, got it. Yeah, I mean, maybe just for keeping maybe some connection going here and to switch it up. Bob, are you able to provide some empathy?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, you know, having some clarity as to where the focus is around this conversation, that helps, you know, that it's really, you know, my understanding around, for you, Bob, it's around kind of like really, yeah, putting the focus into this community. You care a lot about it, and it doesn't work for you to not be able to, and to hear that not everybody is having the same experience in this community. And so for me, it's like, that does have some clarity, because I, you know, wasn't exactly sure, or, you know, I've heard of my experience. I've heard, you know, I've listened to Mickey Cashton's recordings about privilege. And so I have a different understanding of where, of what these workshops are about. And so you know, I'm not trying to say that that's where you were going. I wasn't sure, I guess. And so this provides some clarity for me as to your direction. I don't know if you want to reflect anything there.
Yeah, let me catch that much. So you have some additional insight into where I may be coming from, hearing that it's about wanting to focus on the NVC community, and that offers some clarity that you didn't have. And having listened to Mickey's workshops, you may have a different impression of what her workshops are focused on. Is that it?
Yeah, that captures it. Thank you. And I think to further maybe talk about that, it's that I guess I'm just confused now then. Like it you know, and I can specifically, you know, point out the recordings that I've listened to from Mickey's teleworkshops that have to do with like a broader conversation of privilege and power. So, so there's that. And then for me, it's like, I've gone through pretty extensive personal development workshops, you know, 9 days, 10 days, you know, everything in between kind of. And one of the most powerful lessons that I got was that there's this worldwide personal development workshop. And one of the things that they are big on is that whenever there's an issue from within the organization, they nip it at the butt. Like if So for me, for example, one of the things that that I was introduced to in that workshop is that whenever there's issues that participants have with the workshops, that's immediate and direct feedback to the facilitators who are hosting that workshop, or who were hosting that workshop. And that's something that is worked out from within. So I guess in hearing sort of like what you've heard, Bob, from participants, I'm flabbergasted, and I'm a little surprised and shocked that this has become not something about the trainers, but something broader. I mean, I agree. If there are groups of people who are having trouble at my workshops, I want to figure out, well, what's going on there? Like, like I remember one of my first workshops that I went to, a participant came up to the facilitator and said, "This is so hard to try on because I went to a workshop where the facilitator was telling me that if I'm talking and I'm getting empathy, I can't use words like should, and I can't use words like they're evil." And they were like, and I'm so scared to want to jump back into this workshop. And right, the person who they were talking to was the person who I studied under, who's Tom Bond. And Tom was just trying to figure out, like, well, who was this facilitator? And it was like, let's go to the root of the cause here. And that was in 2012. So I'll just wrap this up here, that for me, it's like, it seems like if if this is something that is affecting participants, I want to figure out how and why, like what is, because in my understanding, a facilitator is a person who's facilitating the workshop. They're, my understanding of facilitator is that they're there to lead and make the experience easier for the people there. And so I guess, when I hear that this is something that has been affecting participants, I'm very concerned. When I hear that this is, maybe, I'm not sure if this has been addressed with those facilitators. So I'm having some disappointment right now as I think about that.
So can I try to reflect some of this?
Yeah.
So you really value a model in which people who are running workshops would really be sensitive to any indication that things are not working for participants, and would really eagerly attend to that and do their best to make sure it doesn't happen again, and that things flow more smoothly, and that they reflect on what they've done that has contributed to this happening, and would have a culture of responsive self-improvement, something like that.
Yeah.
And you've heard some painful stories from people about some workshops involving NVC and topics like power and privilege. And you're just worried that this might not be happening.
Yeah. And just to be clear, that example that I gave was not, from a power and privilege workshop. It was just a regular NVC workshop.
Yeah.
But I mean, above all, one of the things that, I'm not sure if I share those with the NVC community at large, so to say. Like, when I say that, I mean, I'm not sure if this is maybe a shared ideal or a shared value. that I might share with other trainers. And it's not that they should do this. It's just that something that I really value, which is that, and I think you might have, responded to this when I originally wrote about it, Bob, which is that as far as feedback, I'm not sure how responsive NVC trainers are to that. And that is just so concerning. Like, like there's just, I feel there's some sadness because I really value so wholeheartedly everybody's experience in NVC workshops. And, I'm so sure that every NVC trainer's mission is to really spread this out there and to really bring care and inclusion to the world. And when I hear that might not be happening in NVC workshops, I want to know why. Like, I really want to know, if it is the environment, what was the environment? Like, you know what I mean? Like, and maybe again, and this isn't something again that I'm saying that, anybody should do, but I know that I come from a background where I tend to really watch the words that I use in a training, not out of the sense of like, oh, I should be careful with my words, but out of the sense of like, is this really promoting life inclusion or life alienation?
Just want to mention we'd said 10 minutes, so I
okay.
over.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'll just wrap up and say, I have concern. I have major concern when I hear that, yes, this is something that can be affecting participants. And I kind of just want to have, I value clarity and effectiveness. That's what it is. That's really what it is. So,
yeah. So you're concerned when you get a sense that some participants might be adversely affected. You really want clarity and effectiveness, and you'd love for NVC trainers to be responsive to feedback, and you have a sense that might not always be the case. Or concerned. Yeah.
Exactly. And the last thing is, if this is something that is of importance to the NVC community, it sounds like something that's of high importance, utmost importance to discuss with facilitators. Because I think without discussing it and with just, having that inclusion to figure out what to do about it, it seems like something that was missed there. I'm not exactly sure if that's what happened. However, for me, it would seem like the ideal thing to just maybe cultivate an environment for the trainers who are giving these workshops to figure out, what can we do here? That's my last thing. Thank you.
Yeah, but if there are risks of it's not working for participants, you'd really like attention to be given to how to mitigate that, and how, if this is important work to be done, you'd like it to be done with care. Something like that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Could I know that we're over time. I'd love to have as short as I can to get a response in.
Okay. Does that work for you, Antonio?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
And
who are you speaking to?
I think I will speak to Antonio.
Okay.
I am totally aligned with wanting responsiveness to feedback, and deep care for participants. I want those too from the bottom of my heart. Would you be willing to reflect that?
Yeah. I'm hearing you have some alignment with the idea of having responsiveness to participants' feedback. Was that it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And care for participants. It's, for me, that's what part of what's in service to, care.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also about care for you.
Mm-hmm. And I really, really do not like the way that people who do not understand the full context are coming in and being basically backseat drivers to criticize what's happening.
Yeah. So you have some dislike for people who may not have much information about what's going on here in the community to provide criticism or feedback about this.
Yeah. And what we're trying to do is extremely difficult. This is anything related to this topic is extremely difficult. And it's a little bit like people who routinely fix broken bones going to a team of people who's doing delicate cancer surgery and complaining that the cancer surgeons are once in a while losing a patient, which doesn't happen with the people who are just setting broken bones.
Yeah. So first thing is that, yeah, I heard that you say that this is something really, really difficult to work on. Right? Challenging? Is that the word that you use? Yeah. And anything around it is challenging. And, I heard you say that there's people who can, sometimes fix broken bones. Right? But then there's people who are dealing with cancer who will lose a patient sometimes, where I think you said that people with broken bones can just kind of repair themselves, something like that?
Well, the doctors who are treating people with broken bones, they're not going to often lose a patient.
Right. Okay. Right. Whereas the doctors who are dealing with patients with cancer will lose somebody.
Right. And so I don't want the doctors who are treating broken bones to judge the people who are doing cancer care and say, you're obviously doing something wrong. Stop doing it. You shouldn't be doing your cancer treatment.
Right.
Because some people are suffering.
Yeah. Yeah. So you really like it to stop that for the doctors who are fixing broken bones to tell the cancer doctors to stop doing what they're doing because they're losing people.
Which is not to say that it does not completely break my heart when we lose someone, when they do not have a positive experience. It does.
Right.
And I'm fiercely committed to doing everything in my power to change that and improve that.
Yeah. So I'm hearing that there's impact on you. You're affected when somebody is lost, and you're very committed to making sure that that doesn't really happen, that you don't really lose somebody.
Yeah. But it doesn't help when people who don't understand the complexity of what we're trying to do come in and act as if, well, it's obviously what you're doing wrong, and they're making assumptions about what's happening and then judging it. That doesn't help. That doesn't help make things better.
Yeah. So sort of like in this search for really having some improvement, it's frustrating, and you don't really see it as a contribution when somebody comes in who doesn't really have the full understanding around the complexity of this subject, to add something to it, because it just really adds to the layers of frustration and complexity of this already complex conversation.
Yeah, I mean, there's I think that we're trying to tackle one of the biggest problems that humanity has. It's no surprise that no one is perfect at dealing with it. I would love some partnership in being committed to dealing with it and figuring out something that works. But I'm tired of people on the sidelines saying you're doing it wrong when they haven't even looked at the complexity of the problem that's trying to be solved.
Yeah. You really, you would love some partnership around what seems to be humanity's biggest problem right now. And that it's really not helping when people on the sidelines are saying, hey, you're doing it wrong. Doesn't really contribute, so to say.
Yeah. So if I welcome any insight that people have to offer, I want to care for any concerns, but I don't want this to be in a frame of people explaining to me how we're not doing it right and that we should stop doing what we're doing.
Yeah. So you're open to some feedback and some contribution. However, you find it really troubling when it comes from the light of what you're doing wrong and how you should be doing it. It's really not the contribution that you're looking for.
And without a willingness to actually partner in caring for solving the problem that we're trying to solve, ending the suffering that we're trying to bring relief to. These same trainings that some people found alienation from, other people said, oh my God, I finally have a home in the NVC community. I'm inspired. This is the first time I've ever had hope for NVC being a place for me. There needs to be balance. You can't just focus on those that's not working for without focusing on the good. Any more than in the mainstream community, it works to only focus on the good and not focus on the bad. It's unbalanced.
Right. Yeah. It's almost like the contributions that have been coming in have really been coming in maybe from a one-sided view of who this isn't working for. However, you really want to go ahead and have contribution to, how can we really improve this? Not to really take it away, but how to really add to it, so that, because as it turns out, like you're saying, this is really working for some people. And the contribution that you'd like would be in the form of how else can we improve this?
Yeah, so take, for example, and I'll oversimplify this. Suppose standard NVC workshops work for all the white people and only 20% of the black people. And then we create a workshop that works for 80% of the black people and 70% of the white people.
Right.
It's not perfect, especially it's a big step down from the perspective of white participants, but there's got to be a place for this. We want it to work 100% for everybody, but the existing things are not working for everybody.
Right.
So I don't want to have standard comparison that says just because what we're doing works poor for some of the white people, a small minority. I mean, I have other white people who were just astounded at how wonderful this was. Yeah. We were being invited to travel to other countries to share this work by white people who found this work valuable.
Right.
I just don't. Anyway,
I'll reflect that.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm hearing that right. It's like, in one light, there could be NVC workshops that are really not working for, they're working for a majority of white people, but maybe not the majority or a very small minority of Black people, which in a way is really unbalanced, where what if there were workshops, NVC workshops specifically, right? NVC workshops you're talking about, where it really contributed a lot more to Black people's experiences, and maybe not so much to white people's experiences, but there at least seems to be more inclusion in the picture, which is that what maybe I'm hearing that you really are looking for.
I'm just, there are segments of the community that the existing NVC infrastructure has been horribly underserving, and we're trying to restore balance, and it's an awkward, imperfect process, and I want it to be okay that it's not yet perfect, and I still want to be able to do the work and have the active support of the community instead of every step of the way getting just these huge expressions of concern and barriers to being able to do the work.
Right. So this is a work in progress. And, you know, it sounds like there's really a lot of frustration when there's opposition to having this work in progress be improved upon. Because the suggestions are not suggestions of how to improve it, but suggestions of how to stop it, which is, really not something that's really contributing in this, juncture.
Thank you. Lifetime of conversation, but maybe that's a pausing place.
Okay. So we have a question of how might we work together to address these issues. I think what we have been doing is one way of moving forward is having these dialogues. So I'm open for having more of them because I feel that, we're still trying to find some convergence and maybe some positive steps of how might we move forward with, be more responsive, caring, and inclusive. And so we're still, looking at, what are possible strategies and next steps that we can take. So I'm open for having, some more of these empathy dialogues. It takes time, but and I do want to, did you feel, is there anything that anyone wants to still say? I mean, is there any burning, like a last couple of minutes reflection for each person, or does everybody feel, I know your stomach is growling, Antonio, I just want to be sure that you feel heard enough to come to a close too.
Yeah, I'd say for myself, yeah.
Okay. So then maybe we just, are you open for having another dialogue? Same format, let things gel a little bit, and we'll continue with the dialogue and maybe even bring in some other people around the topic, get some other perspectives. And does that works for me? Works for you? Okay, well, great.
Works for me. I know usually on Wednesdays, I'm usually only available for maybe an hour. This was a bit of an exception, so.
Okay, so we'll find the time that works for everyone in terms of time frame.
Yeah.
Because these dialogues do take longer, at least a couple hours, and sometimes even 3 hours is a good amount of time for some real transformation to happen. So, okay, well, thanks for taking part in this, and we'll put this online, and we'll continue the conversation. And any final word? I just feel a lot of gratitude for you taking part in this discussion. Any final words?
Yeah, likewise. I'm very grateful for everybody holding this space and sharing. Thank you.
Appreciating this conversation as well. Thank you, both of you.
Okay. Great, thanks. All right, then we'll end the